Number 1, Luis Garavito. If there is a name that represents the absolute nadir of human morality, a name that should cause the same visceral reaction as a plague or a natural disaster, it is Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos. In the grim ledger of criminal history, he stands alone. To the terrified communities of the Andes, he is known simply as La Bestia, the Beast. To the Guinness Book of World Records, he is the most prolific convicted serial killer in the history of mankind. While the Western world trembles at the names of Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, men who killed 30 or 33 victims, Luis Garavito operates on a scale of slaughter that is almost impossible to comprehend. He confessed to the torture, rape, and murder of 193 children. However, forensic anthropologists and investigators who spent years unearthing his mass graves believe the true number sits closer to 300, and perhaps even exceeds 400. His reign of terror in Colombia, spanning the 1990s, was not merely a crime spree, it was a holocaust of the innocent, a systematic extermination of a generation of vulnerable boys that went largely unnoticed by the world for nearly 7 years. To understand how a human being transforms into a predator of this magnitude, one must first look at the fracture in his soul that occurred in the genesis of his life. Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in the small, verdant coffee-growing town of Genova, in the Quindío department of Colombia. On the surface, it was a picturesque landscape of rolling green hills, but inside the Garavito home, it was a domestic hell. He was the eldest of 7 brothers, raised under the tyranny of a father who viewed brutality not as a punishment, but as a language. Manuel Antonio Garavito was a man of extreme violence, ruling his household with a whip and a terrifying temper. Young Luis was not just beaten, he was tortured. He was starved, forced to sleep outside in the rain, and psychologically tormented daily. But the abuse that truly shattered his mind was not the physical blows. It was the violation of his innocence. Garavito was a victim of chronic sexual abuse from a very young age, perpetrated by neighbors and, in a twist of cruelty that defies description, by his own father. This violation dismantled his psyche before it ever had a chance to form. By the time he was a teenager, Garavito was a vessel of internalized rage, confusion, and deep-seated shame. He was a boy who learned early that the world was divided into 2 categories, the masters who inflict pain, and the victims who receive it. Desperate to escape his reality, he turned to alcohol and attempted suicide multiple times, but when the darkness inside him could not be extinguished, he began to project it outward. He discovered a dark, twisted attraction to young boys, the very demographic he once belonged to. In his warped mind, he sought to regain control by becoming the master, inflicting upon others the same domination and agony that the world had inflicted upon him. For years, Garavito drifted through the chaotic landscape of Colombia as a vagrant. He worked odd jobs, slept in parks, and drank himself into stupors. But in 1992, the drifting stopped, and the hunting began. To understand how he operated with such impunity, one must understand the context of Colombia in the 1990s. It was a nation bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The civil war between government forces, left-wing guerrillas like the FARC, and right-wing paramilitaries had displaced millions of people. The drug cartels were waging war on the streets. The cities were overflowing with refugees and, most tragically, with gamins, street children. These were kids who cleaned windshields at traffic lights, sold candy on buses, or simply begged for pesos to survive. They were the desechables, the disposables. They were invisible to the state, ignored by society, and utterly unprotected. But they were visible to the beast. Garavito's methodology was terrifyingly effective because it relied on the one thing these children were starved of, kindness. He did not snatch children from the streets with brute force, he seduced them with hope. Garavito was a chameleon, a master of disguise and psychological manipulation. He would spend days observing a plaza or a park, identifying the most isolated, hungry, or lonely boy. Then, he would assume a persona tailored to that specific child's vulnerability. Sometimes he would dress as a monk or a priest, carrying a Bible and prayer beads, radiating an aura of holiness and charity. Other times, he would pose as a simple street vendor, a disabled man needing assistance, or a representative of a fictitious charity foundation dedicated to helping the poor. He would approach the child with a soft, grandfatherly voice. He would offer them a soda, a warm meal, or a few coins. But his most potent lure was the promise of work. He knew the desperation of poverty. He would tell the boys that he needed help carrying boxes to a farm, or that he could get them a job picking coffee beans, counting cattle, or working in a warehouse. For a starving child in a poverty-stricken country, this offer was not just an opportunity, it was a miracle. It was a chance to earn money for their mothers, a chance to be a man, a chance to escape the streets. Trusting the kind stranger with the gentle eyes, they would walk with him willingly. Garavito would lead them out of the safety of the town, walking for miles into the dense vegetation that surrounds many Colombian cities. He would walk them into the vast sugarcane fields, the coffee plantations, or the isolated ravines filled with thick brush. Throughout the journey, he would chat with them, asking about their lives, their families, and their dreams, gaining their absolute trust. He played the role of the benevolent protector until the very last second. But once they were deep in the wilderness, far from the eyes of the world and the noise of the city, the mask would fall. The violence that ensued in those lonely fields is difficult to describe without flinching. Garavito did not just kill, he obliterated. He unleashed a lifetime of suppressed rage upon these small bodies. He would tie his victims up, often using their own shoelaces or strips of their clothing, turning the binding into a sadistic game. He would torture them for hours, deriving sexual pleasure from their agony. The details of the autopsies reveal the level of savagery that traumatized even the most hardened forensic pathologists. Many victims were decapitated. Bodies were found with bite marks, evidence of a cannibalistic urge to consume the victim's essence. He kept trophies, pictures, small trinkets, or pieces of clothing, which he would later use to relive the crimes in his moments of solitude. After the murder, he would leave the bodies to rot in the tropical heat, where the dense vegetation and scavenging animals would quickly erase the evidence. For 5 years, Garavito traveled across Colombia like a phantom plague. He moved from city to city, Pereira, Cali, Armenia, Ibague, Villavicencio, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. He treated murder not as a passion, but as a daily routine. He was methodical. He kept a ledger, a blue notebook in which he meticulously recorded his kills. He drew lines for each victim, sometimes marking the date, the location, or a nickname. It was the diary of a one-man genocide. In some towns, he would kill 3 or 4 children in a single week. The police were, for a long time, completely oblivious. Because the victims were poor street children, their disappearances were rarely reported immediately. When parents did go to the police, they were often dismissed with apathy. He probably ran away to Bogotá to find work, the officers would say. He'll come back when he's hungry. This social prejudice was Garavito's greatest shield. He hid behind the indifference of a society that had forgotten its own children. It wasn't until late 1997 that the scale of the horror began to emerge, and the ground began to give up its secrets. In the municipality of Pereira, in the heart of the coffee region, a mass grave was discovered in a steep ravine. The bodies of 3 children were found huddled together, bound and mutilated. The local investigators initially suspected a satanic cult or a paramilitary cleansing operation. But then, they found more bodies. And more. In the fields surrounding Pereira alone, over 25 bodies were eventually recovered. They all bore the same signature, the intricate knots, the sexual violence, the bite marks. The police realized with dawning horror that they were not dealing with a cartel or a death squad. They were dealing with a single, monstrous entity. A special task force was formed, comprised of Colombia's best detectives. They began to connect the dots between similar clusters of bodies found in other departments. A profile emerged, a solitary male, traveling constantly, targeting boys between the ages of 8 and 16. But they had no name, no face, and no fingerprints. Garavito was a ghost. He had no ID, no fixed address, and he moved through the shadows of the underworld. His downfall, when it finally came in April of 1999, was not the result of a high-tech manhunt, but a result of his own compulsive behavior and a stroke of luck. He was spotted in the city of Villavicencio, lurking near a group of children in a rough neighborhood. A homeless man, who had heard whispered rumors of a child snatcher operating in the area, felt a chill of recognition. He alerted the police. When officers approached Garavito, he was in the process of attempting to lure a young boy into a dark alley. He was arrested on the spot, not for murder, but for attempted kidnapping. At the police station, Garavito played the role of the confused, innocent drifter. He gave a fake name. He acted feeble and harmless. But the investigators noticed something. He wore thick, distinctively framed glasses. A description from a surviving victim years earlier, a boy who had miraculously escaped the beast's clutches, had mentioned a man with glasses. The detectives felt a current of electricity. They began to dig into his background. They found his real identity. And then, in his meager belongings, they found the smoking gun, the blue notebook. It contained codes, tally marks, and pictures of young boys. It was a ledger of death. The interrogation of Luis Garavito is one of the most chilling encounters in the history of criminal psychology. For hours, he denied everything. He sat calmly, staring at the wall, impenetrable. But the investigators were relentless. They laid out the photos of the bodies found in Pereira. They showed him the faces of the children he had erased. Something in Garavito broke. Perhaps he wanted credit for his work, or perhaps the burden of the secrets was simply too heavy to carry alone. He began to talk. And once he started, the floodgates opened. He confessed to 147 murders initially. He spoke with a calm, monotonous voice, describing the slaughter of children as if he were describing a trip to the grocery store. He did not show remorse, he showed precision. To prove he was telling the truth, he asked for maps. He guided the police to mass graves scattered across the Colombian landscape, graves that no one knew existed. He remembered the specific locations of bodies buried years ago. He remembered what the boys were wearing. The excavation of these sites was a national trauma for Colombia. Day after day, television crews filmed as weeping police officers and forensic teams pulled tiny, decomposed skeletons from the earth. Mothers who had spent years waiting for their sons to come home, keeping their bedrooms untouched, watched in horror as clothes and shoes were identified on the evening news. The country was paralyzed by a mixture of grief and blinding rage. Garavito, the man responsible for this ocean of pain, sat in his cell, asking for a Bible and complaining about the food. The trial of Luis Garavito exposed a fatal, infuriating flaw in the Colombian legal system. Under Colombian law at the time, the maximum sentence for any crime, regardless of the brutality or the number of victims, was 40 years. There was no life imprisonment. Furthermore, the law allowed for generous sentence reductions for confession, cooperation with authorities, and good behavior. Garavito, the man who slaughtered nearly 200 children, was technically sentenced to 835 years in prison, a symbolic number calculated by adding up the sentences for each victim. But in reality, due to the statutory cap, he could only serve 40 years. And thanks to his cooperation in finding the bodies, that sentence was immediately reduced to just 22 years. This revelation sparked outrage not just in Colombia, but across the world. The idea that the beast could potentially walk free in the early 2020s terrified the nation. It led to protests and demands for legal reform. However, the Colombian authorities, fully aware of the danger he posed and the certainty that he would be lynched by the public if released, managed to keep him incarcerated. They engaged in a legal chess game, constantly bringing up new charges from unresolved cases to deny his parole and keep him behind bars. In prison, Garavito underwent a strange and disturbing transformation. He claimed to have found God. He became a model prisoner, preaching the gospel to other inmates and carrying a Bible wherever he went. He gave interviews to journalists, crying crocodile tears about his past, blaming the devil, his abusive father, and alcohol for his actions. He grew a beard and began to look like the biblical figures he quoted. But the psychologists who studied him saw through the act. They saw a psychopath who was simply manipulating his new environment. He was playing the role of the repentant sinner, just as he had played the role of the kind monk to lure his victims. It was just another disguise. Inside, the predator was still there, feeding on the attention. The story of the beast finally came to an end on October 12, 2023. Luis Alfredo Garavito died in a hospital in Valledupar at the age of 66. He died of complications from leukemia and eye cancer, a slow and painful wasting away. His death was met with a collective sigh of relief from a nation that had lived in fear of his potential release. There were no mourners at his funeral. No family came to claim him. His body was cremated, turning the monster into a pile of ash, ensuring that there would be no grave for his followers to visit, no shrine to his evil. Luis Garavito leaves behind a legacy that is difficult to comprehend. He serves as a grim reminder of the vulnerability of the poor in the developing world. He showed us that a monster does not need superpowers, high-tech gadgets, or a genius IQ, he only needs a society that looks the other way. He hunted the children that no one was watching, and in doing so, he became the deadliest predator humanity has ever produced. The tragedy is not just that he existed, but that for 7 long years, in the crowded plazas and sunny fields of Colombia, nobody noticed he was there. His life is a dark mirror reflecting the cost of indifference, and his name will forever stand as a warning of what happens when the world forgets its most innocent souls. Here is the complete, seamless, deep dive script for number 2, Pedro López. This segment tells the story of the monster of the Andes, a man whose crimes spanned 3 nations and whose current whereabouts remain one of the most terrifying question marks in criminal history. Number 2, Pedro López. If Luis Garavito was the beast who hid behind a mask of kindness, Pedro Alonso López was the monster who walked in the open, a predator who viewed the entire continent of South America as his personal slaughterhouse. He is known to the world as the monster of the Andes. While Garavito's victims were mostly boys, López hunted young girls, targeting the innocent indigenous daughters of the Andean highlands. He claims to have murdered more than 350 girls across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. But the most terrifying aspect of Pedro López's story is not the number of lives he stole, nor the brutality of his methods. It is the ending. Unlike the other monsters on this list who died in prison or faced execution, Pedro López walked out of prison a free man. Somewhere in the world today, or perhaps buried in an unmarked grave, the monster of the Andes is gone, leaving behind a legacy of fear that spans 3 borders. To comprehend the darkness of Pedro López, we must descend into the abyss of his origins. Born in 1948 in Tolima, Colombia, during a period of violent political unrest known as La Violencia, López was born into chaos. His mother was a prostitute who had 13 children by different fathers. When Pedro was 8 years old, he allegedly caught his mother having sex with a client. Enraged, she threw him out of the house. He never returned. At the age of 8, Pedro López became a gamin, a street child fighting for scraps in the gutters of Bogotá. His life on the streets was a relentless cycle of victimization. He was beaten, starved, and abused. But the event that killed the last shred of his humanity occurred when he was 18. He was arrested for stealing a car and thrown into a chaotic Colombian prison. There, he was gang-raped by 4 inmates. Something inside López snapped. He didn't just survive the assault, he retaliated. He managed to kill 3 of his attackers in prison. When he was released 2 years later, he was no longer a victim. He was a predator who had tasted blood and found that he liked it. He had developed a deep, pathological hatred for women, blaming his mother for his abandonment and projecting that rage onto every young girl he saw. In 1969, López began his odyssey of death. He moved into Peru, presenting himself as a drifting merchant. He targeted the indigenous tribes of the Andes, communities that were isolated, poor, and often distrustful of the police. This was his strategic genius. He knew that the disappearance of a poor indigenous girl in the mountains would not make the headlines in Lima. He preyed on the Ayacucho region. He would lure young girls, usually between the ages of 9 and 12, with simple trinkets, mirrors, hair clips, or candy. He would lead them into the remote ruins or empty fields, where he would rape and strangle them. He claimed to have killed more than 100 girls in Peru alone. But the locals eventually became suspicious. In 1978, he was caught by a group of Ayacucho villagers attempting to abduct a girl. They didn't call the police immediately, they buried him up to his neck in the sand and prepared to stone him to death. He was saved only by the intervention of a passing American missionary who convinced the tribe to hand him over to the authorities. The Peruvian police, unaware of the scale of his crimes and eager to be rid of a Colombian drifter, made a catastrophic mistake. They deported him back to Colombia. They unleashed the monster back into the wild. López didn't stay in Colombia. He moved south, crossing the border into Ecuador. It was here, in the lush, rainy valleys of the Andes, that his violence reached its peak. He settled near the cities of Ambato and Quito. The markets of Ecuador were his hunting grounds. He would wander through the crowded stalls where mothers sold vegetables and textiles, watching the daughters who played nearby. He was a phantom. He struck at twilight, leading girls away with a soft voice and a promise of a gift. His cruelty was absolute. He told later interviewers that he liked the girls in Ecuador because they were more gentle and trusting. He described the moment of murder not as an act of rage, but as an act of possession. He would look into their eyes as they died, believing he was absorbing their innocence. He buried them in mass graves near the rivers, often returning to the sites to sleep on the ground above them, claiming he felt peaceful in the company of his angels. The discovery of his crimes came in 1980, and it came from the earth itself. A flash flood in the city of Ambato eroded the banks of a dry riverbed. When the waters receded, the villagers were horrified to see the skeletal remains of 4 young girls protruding from the mud. The police began to dig. They found 53 bodies in that single location. The field of bones became national news. Ecuador was in a state of panic. López was captured shortly after, in a market in Ambato, caught in the act of trying to lure yet another girl. When the police interrogated him, they expected a denial. Instead, they got a boast. López was proud. He sneered at the detectives, calling them incompetent. He told them, "You found 53. That is nothing. I have killed hundreds." He then led the police on a macabre tour of the countryside. He took them to ravines, to lonely trees, to construction sites. At each stop, they found a body. In Ecuador alone, he confessed to 110 murders. The most famous documentation of Pedro López came from an interview with Ron Leitner, a journalist who visited him in the Ambato prison in the early 80s. The photo taken that day is iconic. López stands behind the bars, his eyes burning with an intense, terrifying intelligence. He told Leitner, "I have lost my innocence at the age of 8. So I decided to take the innocence of others." He spoke of his victims as if they were flowers he had picked. He showed zero remorse. In fact, he expressed a desire to be released so he could kill the women of the world. The trial in Ecuador was swift. He was convicted of the murder of the 110 girls whose bodies were found. But then, the legal tragedy of Latin America struck again. Just like in the case of Garavito, the maximum sentence in Ecuador at the time was 16 years. There was no life sentence. No death penalty. For killing over 300 children across 3 countries, Pedro López was sentenced to 16 years in prison. López served his time. He was a difficult prisoner, often fighting and threatening others, but the calendar was relentless. In 1994, 2 years early due to good behavior, Pedro López was released from prison in Ecuador. However, he was immediately rearrested as an illegal immigrant and deported back to Colombia. In Colombia, he was placed in a psychiatric institution in Bogotá. He spent 3 years there. The doctors evaluated him and, in a decision that defies all logic and sanity, declared him sane and no longer a danger to society. In 1998, Pedro López was released. He walked out of the asylum, a free man. He was 50 years old. The world did not notice his release immediately. It wasn't until 2002, when Interpol issued a red notice for his arrest regarding a new murder in Colombia, that the public realized the monster of the Andes was loose. But it was too late. López had vanished. For over 20 years, rumors have swirled. Some say he is dead, killed by drug dealers or vigilantes. Others say he is living as a beggar in the streets of Bogotá, an old man invisible to the passing crowds. Some fear he moved to Venezuela or returned to the mountains of Peru to continue his work. There has been no confirmed sighting of him since 1999. The story of Pedro López is a dark, open wound in the history of South America. It is a testament to the failure of borders and bureaucracies to protect the innocent. While Western monsters are locked away in supermax prisons, the monster of the Andes walked free. His legacy is not just the 300 girls he killed, but the terrifying silence that follows his name. Every time a child goes missing in the highlands of Ecuador or the streets of Colombia, the old women cross themselves and whisper his name, wondering if the old man with the burning eyes has returned to the mountains. Number 3, Daniel Camargo Barbosa. In the dark history of South American crime, there is a grim triumvirate known as the Three Beasts. We have met the drifter Pedro López and the manipulator Luis Garavito. But the third member of this triangle was different. He was not a ragged vagrant or a man hiding in the shadows of the underworld. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was an intellectual. He was well-dressed, articulate, and possessed a terrifyingly high IQ. He did not hunt with brute force, he hunted with charm. He is known as the sadist of Charquito, and later, the monster of the mangroves. His story is unique not just for the 150 women he murdered, but because he is one of the few men in history to escape a maximum security island prison surrounded by sharks, only to use his freedom to launch a second, even bloodier wave of terror in a neighboring country. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born in 1930 in the Andes Mountains of Colombia. His descent into darkness began, as it so often does, in the home. His mother died when he was an infant, and his father remarried a woman who fit the archetype of the evil stepmother, with horrific precision. She hated Daniel. She dressed him in women's clothing to humiliate him, beat him, and forced him to sleep under the stairs. This early feminization and humiliation planted a seed of deep misogyny. He grew up hating women, viewing them as the source of his pain. But unlike many abused children who struggle academically, Daniel was brilliant. He devoured books. He taught himself new languages. He realized early on that his mind was his greatest weapon against a world that rejected him. His criminal career began in Colombia in the 1950s and 60s. Initially, he did not kill. He was a predator who enjoyed the power of deflowering virgins. He would abduct women, rape them, and then let them go. But the compulsion escalated. In 1964, he claimed his first life. Over the next decade, he terrorized the central region of Colombia. His method was sophisticated. He would pose as a foreigner, often putting on a fake accent, claiming to be Brazilian or American. He would approach women in upscale neighborhoods or near schools, asking for directions or offering them a job as a maid or secretary for his wealthy family. His refined manners and clean clothes disarmed them. He didn't look like a rapist, he looked like a gentleman. By 1974, the police caught up with him. He was arrested for the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl in Barranquilla. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But the Colombian authorities made a decision they would regret for decades. They sent him to Gorgona Island. Gorgona Island was the Alcatraz of Colombia. Located 35 miles off the Pacific coast, it was a hellscape of venomous snakes, humid jungle, and prison guards who were as brutal as the inmates. The ocean surrounding the island was patrolled by sharks. Escape was considered impossible. But Daniel Camargo was not an ordinary prisoner. He studied the tides. He studied the currents. He learned the patterns of the patrols. In November of 1984, Camargo made his move. It was a feat of endurance and madness. He constructed a crude raft made of logs and vines during a work detail in the jungle. Under the cover of a storm, he slipped into the shark-infested waters. For 3 days, he drifted. He battled dehydration, exposure, and the constant fear of predators from the deep. Miraculously, the currents carried him to the mainland of Ecuador. The Colombian authorities assumed he had drowned. They closed his file. The beast of Gorgona was dead, they thought. But Camargo was alive. He washed ashore in Ecuador, exhausted but free. And he was hungry. He made his way to Quito, the capital of Ecuador. He reinvented himself entirely. He became an evangelical pastor. He walked the streets with a Bible under his arm, preaching about redemption. He used his charisma to integrate himself into the community. But beneath the guise of the holy man, the monster was awake. He viewed his survival at sea as a divine sign, not that he should repent, but that he was chosen to continue his work. His second reign of terror in Ecuador, from 1984 to 1989, was even more savage than his first. He targeted young virgins, specifically schoolgirls. He believed that by consuming their innocence, he was extending his own life. He would wait outside schools, dressed impeccably. He would tell a girl that he was looking for a specific address, or that he was a foreigner who needed help translating something. He played the helpless tourist perfectly. Once the girl agreed to guide him, he would lead her into the wooded areas on the outskirts of Quito, known as the Yambos. The violence was ritualistic. Camargo did not just rape, he destroyed. He carried a machete. After sexually assaulting his victims, he would strangle them or hack them to death. He admitted to killing 71 women in Ecuador alone during this 5-year period. Combined with his victims in Colombia, his total body count is estimated to be around 150. Camargo was a narcissist who believed he was smarter than the police. And for a long time, he was. He left no fingerprints. He changed his appearance constantly. But his arrogance was his Achilles heel. In 1986, he killed a young girl named Elizabeth in Quito. He was seen by a witness walking with her. The witness described a polite, older man with a foreign accent. In 1989, police in Quito detained him essentially by accident during a routine sweep of a park. They noticed he was acting nervously. When they checked his bag, they found a machete and some women's clothing. But they didn't know who he was. To them, he was just a vagrant named Bonifacio. It was during the interrogation that Camargo's ego took over. He couldn't stand being treated like a common criminal. He wanted them to know who they had caught. He revealed his true identity. He told them about Gorgona Island. He told them about the escape. And then, he offered to take them to the bodies. Just like Garavito and López, Camargo led the police on a tour of horror. He took them to the dense brush outside Quito and pointed to the ground. "Dig here," he would say. And every time, they found a skeleton. Camargo's confession was shocking in its coldness. He told a journalist, "I am not a madman. I have a very lucid mind. I killed them because they were there." He blamed women for their own deaths, claiming they were too trusting, too naive, and that he was teaching society a lesson. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed in Ecuador at the time. It seemed that justice had once again failed. It seemed he would serve a short sentence and potentially be released to kill again, just like Pedro López. But Daniel Camargo Barbosa did not account for the one variable his high IQ couldn't control: revenge. The prison system in Ecuador is violent and porous. Among the inmates in the Garcia Moreno prison in Quito, word spread about who Camargo was. The other prisoners despised him. Child killers occupy the lowest rung of the prison hierarchy in South America. But there was someone specific waiting for him. Giovanni Nogueira was an inmate at the same prison. He was also the cousin of one of Camargo's victims. He had been waiting for justice, and when the courts failed to provide a life sentence, Nogueira decided to deliver the sentence himself. On November 13, 1994, inside the prison walls, Giovanni Nogueira approached Daniel Camargo Barbosa. There were no guards around. Nogueira pulled out a chuzos, a homemade prison shank. He stabbed Camargo repeatedly. The monster of the mangroves, the intellectual genius who had outsmarted the police of two nations and survived the sharks of Gorgona, bled to death on a dirty concrete floor. His death brought a definitive end to the career of one of the most dangerous men in Latin American history. Unlike Pedro López, who walked free, or Luis Garavito, who died of natural causes, Daniel Camargo met a violent, poetic end. He died by the sword, just as he had lived. His brain was removed during the autopsy and, much like the European killers we discussed, it was preserved in a jar in a museum in Quito, a biological specimen of pure evil. To this day, looking at the preserved brain of the sadist of Charquito, one wonders if the genius and the madness were physically intertwined, or if he was simply a man who chose, again and again, to be a monster. Number 4, Adolfo Constanzo. We now leave the humid jungles of the Andes and travel north, to the scorching, dusty borderlands where Mexico meets the United States. In the criminal underworld, there are men who kill for money, men who kill for pleasure, and men who kill for revenge. But Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo killed for something far more dangerous, he killed for magic. He is the godfather of Matamoros, the leader of a cult known as Los Narcosatánicos. While the other monsters on this list hunted in the shadows to hide their crimes, Constanzo turned murder into a religious institution. He built an empire on the belief that the cauldron, the Hnana, demanded blood, and in exchange, it would grant his followers the ultimate gift, invisibility from the police and immunity from bullets. This is the story of how a handsome, charismatic model from Miami became the high priest of a slaughterhouse that nearly brought the US and Mexican governments to the brink of a diplomatic crisis. To understand the rise of El Padrino, the Godfather, we must look at the unique spiritual stew of his upbringing. Adolfo Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida, in 1962. His mother was a Cuban immigrant and a practitioner of Santeria and Palo Mayombe, Afro-Caribbean religions that involve ritual and spirit worship. While these religions are generally peaceful, Constanzo was exposed to a darker, bastardized version of them. From the age of mere months, he was bathed in blood during initiation rituals. His mother believed her son was a chosen one, destined for greatness and power. She taught him that the spirits protected him, that he was special, and that morality was a concept for the weak. Constanzo grew up to be a chameleon. He was bisexual, handsome, and worked as a model. He had a magnetic personality that drew people to him. But beneath the charm was a predator who had learned that fear was a currency. He began to practice limpias, spiritual cleansings, for drug dealers in Mexico City. He would predict the future, tell them when to move shipments, and perform rituals to protect them from the law. And the terrifying thing was, he was right. His predictions came true. The shipments he blessed got through. Whether this was luck, intuition, or a network of informants, the drug lords believed it was magic. And once they believed, they belonged to him. In the mid-80s, Constanzo moved his operations to Matamoros, a gritty city just across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. He partnered with the powerful Calzada drug family, eventually usurping their power and taking over their territory, not by gunning them down in a traditional war, but by terrorizing them with rituals. He established his headquarters at Rancho Santa Elena, a nondescript farmhouse in the desert. To the outside world, it was just a ranch. Inside, it was a temple of doom. Constanzo recruited a circle of followers who were not uneducated thugs, but often young, affluent, and seemingly normal people. His second-in-command was Sarah Aldrete, a tall, attractive college student known as La Madrina, the godmother. She was a star student at a Texas college by day and a high priestess of human sacrifice by night. This duality is what makes the Constanzo case so disturbing. He could corrupt anyone. The core of Constanzo's power lay in the Na-Na. In the Palo Mayum faith, the Na-Na is an iron cauldron containing sacred earth, sticks, and bones, believed to house a spirit. But Constanzo twisted this tradition into a nightmare. He told his followers that for the Na-Na to be powerful enough to stop bullets, it needed to be fed. It didn't want chickens or goats anymore. It wanted the supreme sacrifice. It wanted human brains, human spines, and human hearts. The killings at Rancho Santa Elena were ritualistic and excruciating. Constanzo and his executioners, like the ruthless El Dubi, would kidnap rivals, strangers, or drug dealers who had crossed them. They would bring them to the killing shack. The victims were often tortured while alive because Constanzo believed that the victim's scream carried the soul's energy. If they died screaming, the magic was stronger. They were mutilated, their vertebrae removed to be made into necklaces for the cult members. The bodies were then hacked apart and burned or buried in shallow graves around the ranch. For months, the desert floor swallowed the dead, and the drug shipments continued to flow, reinforcing the cult's belief that the blood was working. But Constanzo's arrogance, the belief that he was a god, led to his downfall. He needed a specific kind of sacrifice. He believed that the brain of an American student, someone with a bright future and privilege, would provide a superior kind of energy for his cauldron. On March 14, 1989, his men snatched Mark Kilroy. Mark Kilroy was a 21-year-old pre-med student from the University of Texas. He was in Matamoros on spring break, enjoying a night out with friends. He was the quintessential, all-American boy, athletic, studious, and innocent. As he walked down the street looking for a taco stand, a truck pulled up. Constanzo's men grabbed him. His friends watched in confusion, thinking he had met someone or was playing a joke. They never saw him again. Kilroy was taken to the ranch. He was tortured and murdered in a ritual so depraved it shook the hardened Mexican police who later investigated it. But in kidnapping an American citizen, Constanzo had made a fatal error. The disappearance of Mark Kilroy triggered a massive international manhunt. The U.S. government put immense pressure on Mexico. Find Mark Kilroy became a diplomatic command. The breakthrough came by accident. On April 1, 1989, Mexican police set up a routine drug checkpoint. A truck drove through, ignoring the stop sign. The police chased it. The driver led them straight to Rancho Santa Elena. When the police arrived, they didn't find just drugs. They found a cauldron. The site inside the shed at Rancho Santa Elena remains one of the most gruesome crime scenes in history. The cauldron was filled with a foul-smelling stew of blood, animal parts, spiders, scorpions, and a human brain. But the horror was in the ground. As police began to dig, the smell of death overwhelmed them. They found 12 bodies initially. Then more. Among them was the body of Mark Kilroy. His brain was missing. His spine had been removed. The brutality of his death galvanized the two nations. Constanzo, however, was not at the ranch. He had sensed the danger, or perhaps his informants tipped him off, and fled to Mexico City with his inner circle, including Sarah Aldrete. For weeks, the Godfather was the most wanted man in North America. The media dubbed them the narco-Satanists. The end came on May 6, 1989. Police tracked Constanzo to an apartment building in the Cuauhtémoc district of Mexico City. When the officers surrounded the building, Constanzo did not surrender. He didn't try to negotiate. He began to throw money, thousands of dollars in cash, out of the window onto the street below, creating chaos. He fired his machine gun at the police, laughing. But as the tear gas canisters crashed through the windows and the police prepared to breach the door, Constanzo made his final decision. He looked at his follower, Álvaro de Leon Valdez, known as El Dubi, and gave him a command. Constanzo said, "Do not let them take me alive. I will not give them the pleasure." He ordered El Dubi to shoot him. Terrified of disobeying his master even at the end, El Dubi raised his machine gun and opened fire. He killed Constanzo and his lover, Martin Quintana. When the police kicked down the door, they found the godfather of Matamoros dead in a closet, riddled with bullets, lying next to his lover. Sarah Aldrete was found cowering in a corner, screaming that she had been kidnapped and held against her will, a claim she maintains to this day from her prison cell, though few believe it. Adolfo Constanzo left behind a legacy of absolute terror. He proved that in the modern world, belief is a dangerous weapon. He didn't just sell drugs, he sold the illusion of immortality. The raid on Rancho Santa Elena uncovered a total of 15 bodies, but informants suggest the true count could be much higher, with victims buried in the desert who will never be found. The narco-Satanist case changed the way the world looked at the drug war. It added a layer of supernatural horror to the violence, reminding us that there are men who believe that the only way to become a god is to act like a devil. Number 5, Pedrinho Matador. In the lore of monsters, there is a specific archetype that captures the public imagination more than any other, the anti-hero. The vigilante. The monster who hunts other monsters. In fiction, we have Dexter Morgan. But in the violent, sun-drenched favelas of Brazil, there lived a man who made fiction look tame. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, but the world knew him as Pedrinho Matador, Killer Petey. He stands alone on this list because his victims were not innocent children, helpless women, or naive tourists. His victims were rapists, drug lords, murderers, and traitors. He claimed to have killed over 100 people, with a confirmed count of 71. But the most terrifying statistic of his life is not the number of people he killed, but where he killed them. 47 of his victims were slaughtered while he was already inside a maximum security prison. He was a force of nature that no cage could hold, a man who believed he was the judge, jury, and executioner in a land without law. To understand the rage of Pedrinho Matador, one must understand that he was born into violence quite literally. He came into this world in 1954 on a farm in Minas Gerais, Brazil, with a bruised and battered skull. His father, a violent man, had kicked his mother in the stomach during a fight while she was pregnant with Pedro. That injury to his developing brain perhaps sealed his fate before he took his first breath. He grew up in a household where love was non-existent and brutality was the only language spoken. He never went to school. He never learned to read or write properly. Instead, he learned the laws of the street: strike first, strike hard, and never forgive. His awakening as a predator came early. At the age of 13, Pedro felt the first surge of the killing urge. He pushed an older cousin into a sugar cane press during a fight, nearly grinding the boy to death. But his true career as an avenger began at 14. His father, who was working as a school guard, was fired by the vice mayor of the town of Alfenas on suspicion of stealing food from the school kitchen. Pedro knew his father was a thief, but family honor was paramount. Enraged by the humiliation, 14-year-old Pedro picked up a shotgun. He walked to the city hall and shot the vice mayor dead in front of witnesses. He didn't run. He walked calmly away. Shortly after, he tracked down the real thief, another guard, and killed him too. At an age when most boys are worrying about homework, Pedro was already a double murderer on the run. He fled to Mogi das Cruzes, a chaotic suburb of São Paulo, where the favelas were ruled by drug gangs. Here, Pedro flourished. He killed a drug dealer and took over his business. He recruited a gang. But amidst the bloodshed, he fell in love. Her name was Maria Aparecida, a woman who brought a flicker of light into his dark world. But in the favelas, happiness is a target. A rival gang leader killed Maria while she was pregnant with Pedro's child. The loss snapped the last tether of his humanity. Pedro went on a rampage. He tortured and killed people connected to the rival gang, hunting for the man responsible. When he finally found the killer, he didn't just shoot him, he butchered him. This was the moment Pedro Rodrigues Filho died, and Pedrinho Matador was born. He famously tattooed the phrase, "Mato por prazer," I kill for pleasure, on his arm, a warning to anyone who crossed his path. But the most defining moment of his life, the act that cemented his legend as a monster of biblical proportions, involved his own family. While Pedro was on the run, his father's violence finally reached its peak. His father murdered Pedro's mother with a machete, butchering her in a fit of rage. When Pedro heard the news, he didn't weep. He vowed absolute, Old Testament revenge. He allowed himself to be caught by the police just so he could be sent to the same prison where his father was being held. The encounter happened in a holding cell. Pedro approached his father, the man who had damaged his skull in the womb and murdered the woman who gave him life. Pedro stabbed his father 22 times. But stabbing was not enough. In a detail that has become the centerpiece of his grim legend, Pedro cut open his father's chest, ripped out his heart, and took a bite out of it. He chewed the heart of his creator and spat it on the floor. It was an act of primal savagery that signaled to every other inmate in the Brazilian prison system, this man is untouchable. Pedro was sentenced to prison, but for him, prison was not a punishment, it was a buffet. In the overcrowded, violent dungeons of the Brazilian penal system, Pedrinho Matador found his true calling. He appointed himself the cleaner. He targeted inmates he deemed unworthy. Rapists were his favorite prey. He would strangle them with his bare hands or stab them with shanks made from toothbrushes. He killed snitches. He killed cellmates who snored too loudly or looked at him the wrong way. On one occasion, while being transported in a police van with another prisoner, the officers opened the back doors at the destination only to find the other prisoner dead. Pedrinho had snapped the man's neck during the ride because the man was a rapist. He killed his best friend in prison because the friend poured vodka into Pedrinho's cell during a lockdown, a violation of Pedrinho's personal code. He killed so many people behind bars that his sentence was extended again and again, eventually totaling nearly 400 years. However, under Brazilian law at the time, a person could not be kept in prison for more than 30 years. This created a terrifying legal paradox. The state had a serial killer who wouldn't stop killing, but the law said he had to be released eventually. In 2007, after 34 years in prison, Pedrinho Matador was released. However, he was quickly rearrested in 2011 for riot charges and false imprisonment. He served another 7 years. Finally, in 2018, at the age of 64, the most dangerous man in Brazil walked free for good. What happened next is perhaps the most surreal chapter of his life. Pedrinho didn't go back to the shadows. He went to YouTube. He started a channel called Pedrinho X Matador, Pedrinho the X-Killer. He became a social media influencer. He posted videos commenting on high-profile crimes, advising young people to stay away from a life of crime, and telling war stories from his days in the favelas. He had hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok. He became a pop culture icon, a grandfatherly figure who just happened to have eaten his own father's heart. The public was fascinated by his Dexter-like code. He claimed he had repented, that he had found Jesus, and that he would never kill again. But the streets of Brazil have a long memory, and blood demands blood. The past he had carved with a knife eventually caught up to him. On the morning of March 5, 2023, Pedrinho was standing on the sidewalk in Mogi das Cruzes, the very city where his life of crime began. A black car pulled up. 2 masked men stepped out. They didn't ask for an autograph. They shot Pedrinho multiple times and then, to ensure the legend was truly dead, they cut his throat. The vigilante was executed in broad daylight. Pedrinho Matador leaves behind a complex, bloody legacy. He was a monster, yes. A man who killed for pleasure and mutilated his own kin. But in a country plagued by corruption and violence, many viewed him as a necessary evil, a demon who kept the other demons in check. His life raises an uncomfortable question: in a world full of wolves, do we secretly root for the tiger? Pedrinho proved that sometimes, the only thing that can stop a bad man with a gun, is a bad man with a knife. Number 6, Juana Barraza. Serial killers are almost always men. The statistics tell us that female serial killers are rare anomalies, usually black widows who poison husbands for money or nurses who kill patients for mercy. But in Mexico City in the early 2000s, a predator emerged who defied every profile, every stereotype, and every expectation. This killer hunted with the brute strength of a man but possessed the access of a woman. The press called the killer, La Mataviejtas, the little old lady killer. For years, police believed they were hunting a man dressed in drag. They were wrong. They were hunting a celebrity. They were hunting La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence, a professional lucha libre wrestler who body-slammed opponents in the ring by day and strangled grandmothers in their homes by night. Her name was Juana Barraza. To understand Juana Barraza, one must look at the tragic duality of her life. Born in 1957 in Hidalgo, Mexico, her childhood was a nightmare of abuse. Her mother was an alcoholic who reportedly traded Juana to a man for 3 beers when she was just a child. Juana was subjected to repeated sexual abuse, an experience that planted a deep, burning hatred for her mother, and by extension, for all elderly women who resembled her. This hatred would simmer for decades before boiling over. As an adult, Juana channeled her rage into the ring. She became a professional wrestler in the theatrical world of lucha libre. Under the mask of the Lady of Silence, she was a figure of power and strength, cheered on by crowds. But outside the ring, life was hard. She was a struggling single mother, selling popcorn and working as a domestic cleaner to make ends meet. It was this invisibility, the overlooked cleaning lady, the struggling mother, that became her greatest weapon. Her killing spree began in the late 90s and terrorized Mexico City until 2006. Juana's victims were exclusively elderly women, usually over the age of 60, living alone. Her method was chillingly intimate. She would gain entry to their apartments by posing as a government nurse offering social welfare checks or a helper offering to wash their clothes. She played the role of the good daughter that these lonely women craved. Once inside, the Lady of Silence would strike. She didn't use a gun or a knife. She used her wrestler's strength. She would sneak up behind the elderly women and strangle them with whatever was at hand, a phone cord, a stethoscope, or a pair of pantyhose. The murders were personal, she was killing her mother over and over again. After the kill, she would ransack the apartment, taking religious statues or small trinkets. Crucially, she often left fingerprints, but because the police were looking for a male suspect, her prints in the system were never flagged. The panic in Mexico City was palpable. The media whipped up a frenzy about a monster targeting the city's abuelas. Police were desperate. They launched Operation Park, deploying patrols to areas with high elderly populations. They brought in profilers from France and the FBI. The profiles all pointed to a man, likely a transvestite or someone with a chaotic gender identity, because of the sheer physical strength required to strangle the victims. Police even started arresting and harassing transgender sex workers in the city, convinced they would find the killer among them. They were looking for a wolf, never suspecting the female wrestler. Juana Barraza's luck ran out on January 25, 2006. She had just murdered 82-year-old Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro in the Venustiano Carranza district. She strangled the woman with a stethoscope and stabbed her. As Juana fled the house, carrying a plastic bag with her trophies, a neighbor returned home unexpectedly. The neighbor saw the stranger leaving and realized something was wrong. He chased her. Juana, despite being 48 years old, was fast and strong. But she ran straight into the arms of patrolling police officers. When they arrested her, they found the stethoscope and the stolen items. But the real shock came when they unmasked her history. The press went wild. The terrifying Mataviejtas was a famous luchadora. The image of Juana Barraza, broad-shouldered, with short, dyed hair and a defiant smirk, was plastered on every newspaper in Latin America. The interrogation revealed a woman who felt justified in her rage. She confessed to the murder of Ana Maria but denied the others, claiming she only killed out of necessity or anger in the moment. However, forensic evidence, including fingerprints linked to over 10 other crime scenes, told a different story. Prosecutors linked her to at least 16 murders, though estimates suggest she may have killed nearly 50 women. During her trial, Juana Barraza showed the same theatrical flair she displayed in the wrestling ring. She smiled for the cameras. She rolled her eyes at the prosecutors. She mocked the incompetence of the police who had spent years hunting a man. When the judge asked her occupation, she proudly stated, "I am a wrestler." In 2008, Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in prison. She is currently serving her sentence in the Santa Marta Acatitla prison in Mexico City. Even behind bars, she remains a celebrity. She teaches wrestling to other inmates and runs a taco stand in the prison yard. She has even gotten married and divorced while incarcerated. Juana Barraza is a unique monster in the annals of crime. She shattered the profile of the serial killer. She wasn't a sexual predator in the traditional sense, nor was she a subtle poisoner. She was a warrior who declared war on the elderly, a woman who used her bare hands to crush the generation that represented her trauma. Her case remains a cautionary tale about how stereotypes can blind justice. While the police were looking for a man in a dress, the Lady of Silence was walking right past them, wiping the blood from her hands. Number 7, Francisco das Chagas. The Amazon rainforest is a place of primal beauty and ancient secrets, a vast expanse where the laws of civilization often fade into the humid darkness of the jungle. In the late 1980s and early 90s, the city of Altamira, located in the Brazilian state of Para along the Trans-Amazonian Highway, became the epicenter of a horror so specific and so gruesome that it defied explanation. Poor boys, aged between 8 and 14, began to vanish. When their bodies were found, if they were found at all, they had been subjected to surgical brutality. They were sexually abused and murdered, but the killer's signature was the removal of their reproductive organs. The press called it the case of the emasculated ones of Altamira. For years, the police chased ghosts, cults, and innocent people, while the real monster was fixing bicycles down the street. His name was Francisco das Chagas, and he is arguably the most sadistic predator Brazil has ever known. To understand the terror of Chagas, we must look at the panic that gripped Altamira. Between 1989 and 1993, 19 boys were attacked. Some survived, horribly mutilated, to tell the tale of a man who lured them into the woods. The pressure on the police was immense. In a desperate bid to solve the crimes, authorities fabricated a theory about a satanic sect involving wealthy local doctors, businessmen, and a police officer. They claimed these elites were harvesting organs for black magic. Innocent people were arrested, tortured into false confessions, and imprisoned. It was a modern-day witch hunt. The case was considered closed, and the cult members were demonized by the nation. But the killings didn't stop. They just moved. Francisco das Chagas was a mechanic. He was a quiet, unassuming man who traveled between the states of Para and Maranhão. To the children of the poor neighborhoods, he was a friend. He was the man who knew how to fix their bikes. He was the man who knew where the best wild fruits grew in the forest. He was the expert on catching birds. He used these innocent interests, fruit, birds, bicycles, as his trap. He was a predator who understood the psychology of the Amazonian child, adventurous, free-roaming, but often hungry and trusting. Chagas operated with total impunity because he targeted the invisible class. His victims were the sons of laborers, fishermen, and the unemployed. When a poor boy went missing in the Amazon, it was often written off as an accident, a drowning, a jaguar attack, or a runaway. Chagas exploited this apathy. He would lure a boy into the dense undergrowth with the promise of burrito, fruit or a rare bird. Once they were isolated, the friendly mechanic transformed. His crimes were driven by a terrifying psychosexual compulsion. Chagas didn't just want to kill, he wanted to unmake the masculinity of his victims. He strangled them, often until they fell unconscious, then revived them to torture them further. The emasculation, the removal of the genitals, was his trophy. He believed that by taking their manhood, he was purifying them, or perhaps absorbing their vitality. He would often leave the bodies in positions that suggested a twisted reverence, covered with leaves or hidden in hollow logs. For over a decade, Chagas drifted between Altamira and the capital of Maranhão, São Luís. In São Luís alone, between 1991 and 2002, dozens of boys vanished. The police in Maranhão were just as baffled as those in Para. They suspected organ traffickers. They suspected a new cult. They never suspected the mechanic who lived in a shack full of bicycle parts. The breakthrough came in 2003, and it came from the grave. A young boy named Jonel went missing in São Luís. His family was relentless. They didn't accept the police's indifference. They found witnesses who saw Jonel riding on the back of a bicycle with an older man. The description of the bicycle, and the man, led police to the home of Francisco das Chagas. When detectives arrived at his house, they found a scene of gothic horror. Under the dirt floor of his living room, they found the decomposing body of Jonel. But they kept digging. Under the bedroom, under the kitchen, in the backyard, the mechanic's house was a cemetery. They found the remains of 3 boys buried right there, beneath the feet of where he slept and ate. In his closet, they found a collection of trophies, clothing, bracelets, and news clippings about the missing children. Chagas was arrested, and the floodgates opened. He didn't just confess to the murders in São Luís, he confessed to the murders in Altamira from a decade prior. He described details that only the killer could know, the specific locations of the bodies, the method of mutilation, the conversations he had with the boys before they died. He shattered the police's theory about the satanic sect in Altamira. The doctors and businessmen who had been accused, whose lives had been ruined, were innocent. It had been the mechanic all along. The psychology of Chagas was a dark abyss. During interrogations, he claimed he was a tool of justice, ridding the world of children he deemed future criminals, although there was no evidence his victims were anything but innocent boys. He showed no remorse. He spoke of the killings with the detached technicality of a man repairing an engine. To him, the boys were just broken parts that needed to be dismantled. In a series of trials spanning from 2006 to 2014, Francisco das Chagas was convicted of murdering 42 boys, though authorities suspect the number is likely higher. He was sentenced to a total of over 400 years in prison. He currently sits in a maximum security cell in Brazil, a frail, gray-haired man who looks like a grandfather, but whose hands hold the blood of a generation. The case of Francisco das Chagas is a tragedy on multiple levels. It is the tragedy of 42 innocent lives cut short in the jungle. It is the tragedy of the satanic sect scandal, where innocent people were tortured by the state due to police incompetence. And it is the tragedy of the Amazon itself, a vast, beautiful wilderness that provided the perfect cover for a monster to operate for 14 years, proving that in the rainforest, the most dangerous predator is not the jaguar or the anaconda, but the man on the bicycle. Number 8, Dorangel Vargas. In the catalogue of horrors, cannibalism occupies a special, trembling place in the human psyche. We have spoken of Jeffrey Dahmer in the United States and Andrei Chikatilo in Russia, men who consumed flesh for sexual gratification. But in the city of San Cristobal, Venezuela, living under a bridge near the Torbes River, there was a man who stripped murder of its psychological complexity and reduced it to a grocery trip. His name is Dorangel Vargas, known to the world as El Comediante, the People Eater. He is perhaps the only serial killer in history who killed not out of lust, not out of hate, and not out of ideology, but simply because he was hungry and human beings were the most available prey. Dorangel's story begins in the crushing poverty of the Venezuelan Andes. Born in 1957 to poor farmers, his life was a slide into madness. He drifted into the city of San Cristobal, where he ended up living on the streets. Dorangel suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, hearing voices that told him the world was against him. But unlike most mentally ill homeless men who are victims of violence, Dorangel became the predator. He made his home in the 12 de Febrero Park, a lush, green recreational area where locals went to jog and relax by the river. To the joggers, he was just a harmless, bearded beggar living in a makeshift shack under the Libertador Bridge. They didn't know that the soup he was cooking over his campfire contained the remains of their neighbors. His reign of terror lasted from 1995 to 1999. It was a time of economic hardship in Venezuela, and the disappearance of drifters or lonely laborers didn't raise immediate alarms. Dorangel hunted with primitive efficiency. He fashioned a spear out of a bamboo pole and sharpened stones. He would hide in the dense brush near the riverbank, waiting for a solitary figure to pass by, a drunk stumbling home, an athlete running late at night, or a manual laborer. He didn't torture his victims. He didn't play games. He struck them down quickly, usually with a blow to the head or a stab with his spear. Once the victim was dead, Dorangel the butcher took over. He would drag the body into the bushes and dismantle it with surgical skill. He cut off the head, hands, and feet, parts he considered inedible or too likely to identify the victim, and buried them or threw them into the river. The rest, the muscle, the thighs, the torso, he carved into strips. He treated the human body exactly as a butcher treats a cow. He stored the meat in containers, cooked it in stews with herbs he gathered from the park, or roasted it over an open fire. For 4 years, the people eater lived off this diet. Locals later recalled seeing him looking strangely well-fed and healthy for a homeless man. He even occasionally offered his empanadas or stews to unsuspecting acquaintances or other homeless people. They ate it, thinking it was pork, praising the flavor, never knowing they were consuming the missing citizens of San Cristobal. The horror was unveiled on February 12, 1999. A civil defense team was searching the area near the river for 2 missing young men. They stumbled upon a gruesome sight in the brush, a pile of human feet and hands. As they searched further, they found buried skulls. The police initially thought they had found a dumping ground for a drug cartel or a satanic cult. But then they found the shack. Inside Dorangel's small, filth-ridden shelter under the bridge, they found containers filled with human flesh prepared for cooking. They found human fat stored in jars. When the police confronted the bearded man living there, he didn't run. He didn't deny it. He looked at them with a calm, almost childlike honesty. When asked about the pots, he simply said, "That's meat. For eating." Dorangel Vargas was arrested, and his subsequent interviews with the press turned him into a legend of the macabre. He confessed to killing and eating at least 10 men over a period of 2 years, though authorities found remains suggesting the count was closer to 40. His candidness was terrifying. He spoke about cannibalism like a food critic reviewing a restaurant. In a famous interview from his prison cell, he explained his culinary preferences with chilling detail. He told reporters, "The parts one like the most are the thighs and the calves. That's where the best meat is. I make a good stew with the tongue and the eyes are nutritious." He explained that he preferred to eat men because women's meat is too sweet and gave him a stomach ache, and he refused to eat old people because their flesh was tough and contaminated. He preferred young, healthy men, laborers and athletes, because they had good muscle tone. "It tastes like pork," he said, shrugging. "A bit salter, maybe. But good meat." He expressed no remorse because, in his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't killed them out of malice, he had killed them for survival. "I don't hate anyone," he said. "I was just hungry." He even gave the police recipes, explaining how to season human flesh with local herbs to mask the gamey taste. Because Dorangel Vargas was diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia, he could not be tried as a criminal under Venezuelan law. He was declared inimputable, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was not sent to a prison, but to a psychiatric holding center in Tiquira. However, the tragedy of the Venezuelan system is that there is often no distinction between a prison and an asylum. Today, Dorangel Vargas remains locked up in a police station cell in Taquira, largely forgotten by the collapsing state. He has spent over 20 years in a small cage. Visitors who have seen him describe a quiet, old man who spends his days staring at the wall. Sometimes, he asks the guards for a good piece of meat. He is a living ghost, a reminder of a time when the 12 de Febrero Park became a hunting ground, and a man proved that the line between civilization and savagery is as thin as an empty stomach. Number 9, Robledo Puc. In the early 1970s, Argentina was captivated by a face that appeared on every newspaper front page. It was a face of startling beauty, blonde curls, full lips, and innocent blue eyes. He looked like a movie star, or perhaps a cherub from a Renaissance painting. The press called him El Ángel Negro, the Black Angel, or the Angel of Death. But behind that angelic mask lived a soul so empty, so devoid of empathy, that he terrified even the seasoned detectives who interrogated him. His name is Carlos Robledo Puc, and he is not just a serial killer, he is a living monument to the banality of evil. He killed 11 people before he turned 20, not for passion, but simply because they were in his way. To understand the horror of Robledo Puc, one must strip away the usual motives of the serial killer. He was not abused as a child. He was not poor, he came from a respectable, middle-class family in Buenos Aires. He played the piano. He spoke German and English. He had everything. And yet, he chose to become a predator. Psychologists later described him as a psychopath with zero affect, a boy who felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no pity, no love. His crime spree began in March of 1971. At just 19 years old, Robledo Puc teamed up with a friend, Jorge Ibáñez. They started robbing nightclubs and spare parts shops. But for Robledo, the thrill of theft wasn't enough. He introduced a lethal element. When they broke into a discotheque in Olivos, they found 2 men sleeping, the manager and the night watchman. There was no confrontation. The men were not a threat. Robledo simply walked up to them and shot them both in the head while they slept. It was an execution carried out with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. Over the next year, Robledo Puc and his accomplices went on a rampage that Argentina had never seen before. They killed shopkeepers, supermarket guards, and women. Robledo's violence was impulsive and senseless. In one instance, he shot a baby in a crib because it was crying. He raped his victims not out of lust, but as an afterthought. He killed his accomplices if they annoyed him or threatened to slow him down. The most chilling example of his cold-blooded nature occurred in August of 1971. Robledo was driving a car with his partner, Jorge Ibáñez. He crashed the car. Ibáñez was killed instantly in the wreck. Robledo wasn't hurt. He didn't call for help. He didn't mourn his friend. He simply checked Ibáñez's pockets, took his ID card so the police wouldn't link them, and walked away from the burning vehicle, leaving his friend to incinerate. He quickly found a new partner, Hector Somoza, and the killing continued. But Somoza would soon learn that loyalty meant nothing to the angel. On February 3, 1972, they broke into a hardware store. They killed the night watchman and used a blowtorch to crack the safe. But something went wrong. Somoza made a mistake, or perhaps he just hesitated. Robledo, annoyed, shot Somoza dead on the spot. But he realized that Somoza had his ID in his pocket. Robledo couldn't retrieve it easily. So, in a moment of practical grotesque, he took the blowtorch they had been using to open the safe and burned Somoza's face off to prevent identification. He melted the face of his partner and then walked out into the Buenos Aires night. It was this act that finally caught him. The police found the ID card in the pocket of the faceless man. It led them straight to the house of Carlos Robledo Puc. When the police arrived to arrest him in 1972, they were stunned. They expected a hardened career criminal. Instead, They found a 20-year-old boy with a baby face who offered them coffee. During the interrogation, Robledo didn't crack. He didn't cry. He looked at the detectives with dead, shark-like eyes and confessed to everything with a shrug. He admitted to 11 murders, 17 robberies, and multiple rapes. When asked why he killed the guard while he was sleeping, Robledo famously replied, "It was too much trouble to wake him up." The trial in 1980 was a media circus. The public was obsessed with his beauty and his brutality. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty under Argentine law. But Robledo Puc had one last line to deliver, a line that has haunted the Argentine judicial system for decades. After the judge read the sentence, Robledo stood up, looked at the court, and said calmly, "This is a Roman circus. I was prejudged and convicted beforehand." Then, staring directly at the judges, he whispered, "Someday, I'm going to get out and I'm going to kill you all." That was over 50 years ago. Today, Carlos Robledo Puc is still in prison. He is the longest-serving prisoner in the history of Argentina. He has spent more time inside a cell than outside of it. The golden curls have turned gray, the angelic face has withered into the visage of a bitter old man. He has applied for parole multiple times, but every judge has denied it, citing that he remains a narcissistic psychopath with no remorse. He is a relic of the 70s, a living ghost locked in the Sierra Chica prison. He serves as a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster, sometimes, it looks like an angel. Number 10, Cayetano Santos Cadino. We end our journey into the heart of Latin American darkness not with a hulking beast like Garavito, nor a cult leader like Constanzo. We end with a child. In the folklore of Argentina, there is a boogeyman that parents use to frighten their children into obedience. Behave, they say, or El Petiso will get you. But this is not a ghost story. El Petiso was real. His name was Cayetano Santos Cadino, and he is perhaps the most disturbing entry on this list because he challenges our fundamental understanding of innocence. We like to believe that children are born pure, that evil is something learned or inflicted by the world. But Cayetano Cadino suggests a darker truth, that some people are simply born wrong. Known as El Petiso or Judo, the big-eared runt, he began his reign of terror at the age of 9 and finished it by 16. He terrorized Buenos Aires in the early 1900s, a tiny, demonic figure who drifted through the cobblestone streets looking for toddlers to strangle, burn, or impale. He is the original monster of South America, the child killer who proved that the devil doesn't always wait for puberty. To understand the horror of El Petiso, we must transport ourselves to Buenos Aires in 1912. It was a booming metropolis, the Paris of South America, filled with immigrants from Italy and Spain seeking a new life. Among them were Fiore and Lucia Gadino, Italian immigrants who brought with them a son who would become the city's nightmare. Cayetano was born on October 31, 1896, Halloween Day, a detail that superstitious locals would later find significant. From birth, he was different. He suffered from enteritis and nearly died as an infant. Physically, he was small, frail, and possessed disproportionately large, wing-like ears that made him the target of relentless mockery. But it was his behavior that terrified his family. He did not play, he destroyed. By the age of 5, he was already displaying the classic triad of sociopathy. He tortured animals with a cold, scientific curiosity. He would catch birds and dissect them while they were alive. He would throw rocks at stray dogs just to hear them yelp. But his true obsession was fire. He loved to watch things burn. He would set small fires in the neighborhood, staring into the flames with a trance-like fixation. His father, an abusive alcoholic, beat him mercilessly, but the beatings only seemed to harden the boy. Cayetano didn't cry, he just stared back with empty, hate-filled eyes. His escalation from animals to humans was rapid. In September of 1904, at just 7 years of age, he lured a 2-year-old neighbor, Miguel de Pauli, into an empty lot. He began to beat the toddler with a stone. A policeman happened to pass by and stopped him. Cayetano was taken to the police station, but what could they do? He was 7. They lectured his parents and sent him home. It was a mistake that would cost lives. Over the next few years, the attacks became more frequent and more creative. He blinded a horse with a stick. He tried to drown a child in a horse trough. He burned the eyelids of a 3-year-old girl with a cigarette. He was a predator in short pants, roaming the streets of the Almagro and Urquiza neighborhoods. The police knew him as a delinquent, a nuisance, but they couldn't conceive that this small boy with the jug ears was capable of murder. The turning point came in 1912, the Year of Blood. Cayetano was 15 now, but he looked much younger due to malnutrition. On January 17, he set fire to a warehouse, enjoying the chaos as the firefighters struggled to save the building. But fire was no longer enough. On January 26, the body of 13-year-old Arturo Larora was found in an abandoned house. He had been strangled with a piece of string. His body was partially burned. The police were baffled. Who would kill a child with such intimate cruelty? The climax of his horror occurred on December 3, 1912. It was a warm morning. Cayetano spotted 3-year-old Gesualdo Giordano playing on the doorstep of his home. Gesualdo was the son of a local shopkeeper. Cayetano approached him with the promise of candy. He took the toddler's hand and led him away to an old factory ground near the gasworks. What happened next is one of the most infamous crimes in Argentine history. Cayetano didn't just want to kill Gesualdo, he wanted to see what would happen. He tried to strangle the boy with the string he always carried in his pocket, his signature weapon. But the string snapped. Frustrated, Cayetano looked around for a new tool. He found a 4-inch rusty nail lying in the dirt. In a moment of absolute savagery, he placed the nail against the toddler's temple and used a stone to hammer it into the boy's brain. He then covered the body with a sheet of corrugated iron and walked away to watch the sunset. But Cayetano made a mistake common to narcissists: he wanted credit. He attended Gesualdo's funeral. He stood near the coffin, watching the weeping mother. When the police, who were investigating the murder, asked the crowd if anyone had seen anything, Cayetano couldn't help himself. He didn't confess, but he acted strangely, asking morbid questions about the body. The police became suspicious of the big-eared runt, who was always at the scene of fires and accidents. On December 4, 1912, police raided the Gadino home. Under Cayetano's bed, they found clippings of newspaper articles about the missing children. They found the piece of snapped string. When they brought him in for questioning, he confessed immediately. He confessed with pride. He told them about the nail. He told them about the fires. He told them about the birds. He admitted to 4 murders and 7 attempted murders. When asked why he did it, he gave a response that chilled the detectives to the bone: "I like to see them cry. I like to see the blood." The arrest of a 16-year-old serial killer sent shockwaves through Argentina. The press went wild. They labeled him a biological mistake, a throwback to a primitive state of man. The doctors studied his skull, his hands, and of course, his ears. In a decision that highlights the primitive state of psychiatry at the time, the doctors concluded that his large ears were cutting off the blood supply to his brain, causing his insanity. In 1913, while in prison, surgeons actually performed an operation to reduce the size of his ears, believing it might cure his evil. It did not. Cayetano Santos Gadino was declared mentally insane and sent to the Hospicio de los Mercedes. But he was too dangerous for a hospital. He attacked nurses, tried to strangle other patients, and killed a cat that was the hospital pet. In 1923, he was transferred to the prison at the end of the world, the Ushuaia Penitentiary in Tierra del Fuego. This was a brutal prison located in the coldest, most desolate part of Argentina, reserved for the worst criminals. In Ushuaia, El Petiso or Judo became a legend among the inmates. He was small, weak, and despised. He spent years in silence, a ghost haunting the freezing corridors. But his violent impulses never faded. In 1933, he killed the prison governor's pet cat by throwing it into a wood-burning stove. This was his final mistake. The other prisoners, hardened murderers who somehow still had a code against animal cruelty, or perhaps just hated Gadino, beat him savagely. He never recovered from the beating. Cayetano Santos Gadino died in his cell on November 15, 1944, at the age of 48. He died alone, in the cold dark of Tierra del Fuego, unmourned and unloved. His bones were eventually lost, but his name survived. Today, El Petiso or Judo is a dark icon of Buenos Aires culture. He appears in comic books, plays, and movies. But beneath the pop culture fame lies the terrifying reality: he was a child who looked at the world and saw only things to break.